Meeting of the Public Safety Committee, and pursuant to Order 1082, the motion adopted May 5th, that the committee is commissioned a study on the current situation in federal prisons in relation to Correctional Services Canada response to COVID-19, implementation and operation of structured intervention units, and report of sexual coercion and violence in federal prisons. And I see Pam's hand is up.
Thanks, Chair. And I'm hoping that we can deal with this quite quickly. I want to see if we can get unanimous consent for something. Yesterday, all parties in the House came together to condemn the attack on a Muslim family in London, Ontario, which killed 3 generations of one family. Last night, leaders of all the parties were in my hometown of London to attend a vigil in their memory. And they all spoke about working together, putting partisanship aside to deal with the issue of Islamophobia and hate. So I'm trusting that we can do that today. On May 5th, we passed a motion to study ideologically motivated violent extremism, and we've completed 2 meetings thus far. So I have a motion, which I would ask for unanimous consent to deal with today, that would see us continue our study next week on Monday and add an extra day on Wednesday, because I think it would be important for us to hear from the National Council on Canadian Muslims to talk about the rise of Islamophobia, as well as the Centre for Israel and Jewish Affairs to talk about the rise in anti-Semitism. So, Chair, I got a motion. The clerk has it in both official languages, or should have. So that pursuant to a motion passed on May 5th, 2001, that the Public Safety Committee continue its study on ideologically motivated violent extremism, that the meetings occur on June 14th and June 16th, 2021, and that the committee invite the National Council of Canadian Muslims and the Centre for Israel and Jewish Affairs to appear as witnesses on June 16th. So I'm hoping we can get unanimous consent for that and pass it quite quickly, Chair.
Before I recognize Mr. Motz, I take note that the motion does not have 48 hours, which is the usual expectation. It is not pursuant to the business before the committee, and therefore, unless there is unanimous consent to table and debate the motion, we will have to wait for the 48-hour period. Mr. Motz.
Thank you, Chair. I was just curious to know a couple things. One, we have a couple of outstanding motions before the committee already that we can't lose sight of. And number 2, as much as, you know, I agree that this is a study that requires some fulsome review and direction and recommendation moving forward. I agree with the concept. However, what are we gonna park to not get at before the end of session?
Okay, before
that's what we need to deal with.
Yeah, we're getting into the merits.
Sorry.
I need to know that we can proceed with this motion, and then I can listen to, then we can hear a debate on the contents. So, does the committee give permission to proceed with the motion? I see lots of nodding. I see no objections. So, I take note of Mr. Motz's intervention. I see Madame Lambropoulos and I see Madame Kara.
I just wanted to speak in support of Pam's motion. The last couple of weeks, my office particularly, who has a very high, well, my riding has a very high concentration of Jewish and Muslim Canadians, and both groups are living in fear right now because of events that occurred in Montreal a couple of weeks ago, anti-Semitic events that happened, and now because of the London event that took place. People are afraid to walk in the streets alone. People are having their windows broken into if they have a certain flag or a certain sign on their door. So I definitely think that this is a pressing matter right now, especially, and I feel like it definitely deserves the attention of this committee.
Madam Kara, Madam Stubbs, and Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Chair. And just like Emanuela, I do want to, speak in support of Ms. Damoff's motion, and I want to thank her for actually bringing it forward. Because from the testimony that we've already heard and from NCCOP's report itself, we already knew that the ideologically motivated violent extremism has been growing in Canada and has been getting worse since this pandemic. And given the horrific terrorist attack motivated by Islamophobia that took place in London over the weekend that destroyed a whole family and has broken the entire Muslim community, I think as leaders, the time to act is now. The Muslim community is hurting, so are other communities. And I think this committee, we have the ability to act on this very pressing issue and a chance to do something before the House rises. So I think, and we already know the terrorist attack was part of the larger trend in the rise of IMVE. And I agree with Ms. Damoff's motion that we commit to finish our study on this, to provide the government with recommendations on what needs to be done to ensure that attacks like this do not happen again. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us as elected members, as leaders, and as members of this committee to make that happen, to ensure that all Canadians, whether it is Muslim Canadians, Black Canadians, Asian Canadians, Jewish Canadians, Indigenous people, and racialized Canadians can feel safe, in their homes, in their communities. So I really hope that we can certainly move this motion forward, and I hope that everyone can support it. Thank you.
Stubbs, Mr. Harris.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Pam, for bringing this motion forward. I too agree with the seriousness of it and the concept, the spirit of completing our work and our report, and the specific witnesses that you're suggesting we bring forward in an urgent way to our committee. I sure as heck hope, I do have to say, that if there are immediate tools, which I think we've all been trying to explore, but immediate tools and legislative and policy remedies that could prevent and deter the heinous act and crimes like the heinous act that took the lives of those innocent people and impacted their friends, neighbors, family members, and an entire community is being acted upon in government. Like I just want to say, I sincerely hope that us taking either a day or 3 extra days to report from our committee is not stopping that real work from happening if it is ready to go in government. So Chair, this is just the embarrassing thing a little bit, I guess, to confess. I have my material here prepared for our witnesses in the topic today. Could you or could the clerk just remind us what it is we had planned for which days? Because I think we're just, running up to like 8 days left in session. I'm sure that we all know we want to complete the Levesque report, complete recommendations on Bastrash to drive to action, and then also I think a date for estimates. So just so we can get a sense of logistics, how we can get all this done.
If this motion goes through as presented, we would have to deal with on the Monday. We'd have to deal with the border study in some other fashion. We'd have to deal with the Levesque study or the Levesque report in some other fashion as well. So the motion as presented would bump those two schedules. And then how we would deal with those later, I'm not quite sure. But anyway.
And the Bastrash motion, right?
Bastrash motion, and we actually haven't dealt with.
Right.
So,
okay.
Anyways, Mr.
Chair, are summer sittings like an option, or are we going to run into a technical issue like we did last time? Or
I would have to whip's offices. Because I don't know that we have the ability to go past the 23rd in a hybrid format, except other than to go to real sittings in real places with real people, presumably in real Ottawa. So so that will create that at this point is, as I understand it, up before the parties, and I haven't received a report from our whip, and I don't know the other whips as well. Jack.
I guess the other question is, on on the similar point, on Wednesday, what is currently scheduled for Wednesday?
The Levesque report.
Levesque report for Wednesday and Monday.
Yeah. No, Monday is the border.
Monday's the border study. So we would effectively be removing the agenda and possibly not completing the Levesque study in time to have it back to the House. That's one consequence, I suppose. I agree with the idea of focusing right away on the issue, given this currency. But what I tell you, what strikes me, Pam and others, what's on the minds of people in the Muslim community, in particular, today and now, having in the aftermath of the shock, and I think people are they're very obviously moved and are receiving condolences and prayers and support. But I spoke to the president of the Muslim Association of Newfoundland and Labrador just before this meeting, actually, and what they're interested in hearing is concrete action. They want to see concrete things done. Now, in the House today, Brian Massey, the member for Windsor, asked the question, and after question period, asked to table a series of recommendations that had been made 2 years ago during a committee on how to deal with hate speech and hate crime, and it was rejected. So what I'm gonna say is this. I mean, will I have the floor or not?
Well, I'm interrupting you. You still have the floor, but I'm interrupting you anyways because I want to make sure that the clerk will alert us as to the time,
Okay.
and also that so that I can, if you will, manage our time. I wind you down, Jack, if I need to wind you down. Yeah.
Well, you just may have robbed me of some momentum, but I wasn't planning a long speech. But I want
Jack, I would never rob you of momentum.
What I wanted to do, this is a very serious matter, so I don't want to treat any of it lightly. What I did want to focus on was the fact that if we're going to do this, and I don't know if we're going to be able to finish this IMVE study, there's lots of contentious or contortions about all of the various aspects of it that we've already wondered about, whether they're ideologically motivated or religiously motivated or whatever. What I would prefer to do is to ask both the witnesses proposed, and I don't disagree with the witnesses, that ask them to come and ask them specifically. We know the horrors of both anti-Semitism and the effects thereof, and as well as clearly set before us are the horrors of what's called Islamophobia, which is literally the fear of Islam, but I think it's really more of an Islamic hatred than a phobia. I don't know where that name actually came from. But I think what I would like to do is ask these individuals specifically to address that question, that what is it that they would like to see us report or recommend to government from the various ideas that are out there. And if we can do something specific on that, which may result in a motion to do A, B, C, and D, but do that separately, not as part of the larger study, because all these other questions start coming into it then. And there's lots of things out there. People want to see a crackdown on hate speech on the internet. There's various things that I've heard, but let's ask them what they think we should recommend, and compress it, not into as part of the study that we may or may not get to finish because events seem to overtake committee business during this time of the calendar. And let's see if we can do it on even if we could do it on hear witnesses on one day and hear what they have to say and explore options, and then have another on another day, the second day, listen to proposals and try to do a mini report or a motion that would contain the several proposals. That would be much more preferable to me. I think much more doable and much more efficient than just carrying on with that study that may never get to Parliament because of the times for translation and reports and all of that goes with it.
Okay, good points all. We're probably hovering around 10 minutes right now. I take note that we could bump the Levesque studies scheduled for the 16th down to the 23rd, and which is when the other IMVL study was scheduled. So you essentially, for the Wednesdays, you're just switching dates. So really the only date that would be possibly lost would be on the border issue. I see 1, 2, 3, 4 hands, plus I understand that Madame LaRouche wants to speak as well, and she is in the room all by her lonesome. I saw Madame Kamal Kara first, and then Mr. Lightbound, and then I'll go to Madame LaRouche.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair. I think my hand was up from.
Oh, okay. Joelle.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. When we think that since 2014, 21 Canadians, not counting the London attack, have lost their lives in Canada at the hands of violent extremists, which was ideologically motivated. This is more than any other form of extremism. I think when we're talking about taking concrete steps that we can take as members of Parliament, holding these meetings, inviting the Canadian Council of Muslims and its JAT was suggesting to ask them what concrete steps they would like to see to fight against this scourge that's coming into Canada, as well as anti-Semitism and racism. I think this is an opportunity for them as well to place on the record with a parliamentary committee something that's it's so sensitive at this time. I think this is a concrete step we can take as members of Parliament, and so I support this motion of Pam's, or some version thereof that resembles it, to move forward meetings that we had already planned for in any case.
Okay, I've got we've all got notes of 20 minutes. Again, I want to look at the clerk here. Do we have up to 20 minutes, presumably less than 20 minutes, to talk about this motion?
There are 9 minutes remaining before the vote.
9 minutes before the vote. Okay, so I'm going to say we're going to talk. We'll carry this on for 4 more minutes and then leave the meeting. Apologies to the witnesses, but I'm sure all the witnesses can appreciate the timeliness of this particular motion. With that, I'll turn to Madame LaRouche.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to clarify something, because I think that, well, the request being made today would imply this, as given that this has not been sent 48 hours in advance, it required unanimous vote to extend the study. That's what I've understood. So it requires unanimous consent. And given that that vote could influence any extension of the work after the 23rd, that relates to conversations between whips to determine whether committees will be able to sit this summer or not. There are negotiations underway. As you said in your last statement, Chair, this would imply that the study of Madame Levesque would be postponed to June the 23rd, and there would be no border report completion. So I just want to make sure that I've understood correctly about the kind of decision I have to make. I think there had already been meetings at the committee level on the topic of violent extremism. And there had been an all-party agreement for a number of meetings. So I just want to be sure that this is clarified and that everyone is reminded of this, so as to be able to nourish our reflections, so as to be able to vote.
Mr. Mott's last 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. You know, this is an issue that has grown and it doesn't appear to be ending anytime soon. And I think as much as we need to hear from those, as Joel had indicated, and as Pam has laid out in her motion, nothing prevents the government. I mean, we talk about action. The things we hear between now and June 23rd, and even if we sit for the summer when Parliament isn't sitting, nothing is going to be actionable unless the government decides to action it. And the government doesn't need our committee to tell it to take some action. It can do that on its own. And we got to be mindful of that. Yes, we need to hear from these from witnesses. We need to hear from those communities that are being impacted, and we can learn. And that's important. But I think it's important just for everyone to understand that our committee hearing these and the order we need to hear them and how that all looks. Yes, we have to try and get a lot of work in in a short period of time, but that does not preclude the government from taking action now, in advance. So I just want that to be very, very clear and on the record.
Okay. Now, I'm just about to suspend. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Chair. I have lots of funds with suspensions and adjournments, but I think I'm suspending. And we'll reconvene after the vote. I interpret the conversation as waiving of the 48 hours, that we are into the debate and substance of the matter. And I would like to get a conclusion, if you will, shortly after the vote so we can respect our witnesses. And I still have to get clarification from the whip or from the clerk as to whether we will save the time, if you will, and still have a full 2 hours with the committee. So if you could clarify that, Mr. Clerk. Okay, so we'll clarify it, I guess, after the vote. So with that, we are suspended.
I will have a point of order after we get back, Chair.
Sure, okay. With that, we're going to have to leave this meeting and go back to the House. So meeting is suspended. bring up a point of order, I believe, or some point.
Yes, a point of order. I suggested that I would have a point of order when we came back, and I guess you seemed to be making a ruling just before we left, and I just wanted to clarify it. I understand that your ruling was that there was unanimous consent for the motion to be debated, thereby removing the requirement for 48 hours notice, but that does not mean that there needs to be unanimous consent for the motion or a version of it to be passed.
That's correct.
That is correct. So
yeah.
That was the point of order I wanted to make, because I think there may not be unanimous consent for the order that was put forward, but there seem to be various proposals as to how we might accomplish some of the things that are contained in it. So I'll leave it to others to suggest those.
The chair appreciates the the assistance in making these rulings. With that, I see both Mr. Motts and Madame Damoff. I don't recollect who's first, but since I'm having so much assistance with the rulings, I'll ask Mr. Motts. I'm sure he'll be of great assistance.
Pam's hand was up before I did mine. She can go ahead.
Okay.
So, Chair, I was just going to suggest an alternative. I'm disappointed that there isn't consensus to do the 2 meetings, but to Jack's point about the National Council for Canadian Muslims and the Center for Israel and SECU, I'm sorry, the acronym long name is escaping me. I'm going to suggest that next week we have them for 1 meeting for 90 minutes, 45 minutes for each party, whichever works best for the clerk to do, and then 30 minutes at that meeting to hopefully come up with some consensus for a motion that we could table in the House based on their recommendations. So we would listen to one and then the other for 45 minutes each, then 30 minutes to draft something for the House, and then we would do the border study. And I would leave it to the clerk as to when witnesses were available, whether that was Monday or Wednesday next week. I do think we need to get to this next week, and then that would leave the 21st and the 23rd for the Levesque study. So I would have to amend my motion,
You're amending
Chair.
your motion, and I believe you have to have the consent of the, I think it's unanimous consent to amend your motion. Is that correct, Chair? She's amending her own motion.
You are the chair, Mr. Chair.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. Well,
I was just going to offer some assistance, Chair.
Yeah. I've got plenty of assistance, only one of which is competent. Mr. Clerk.
Normally, to amend your own motion, you would require unanimous consent of the House because it belongs to the committee now, or somebody else may move the amendment.
All right.
Can I ask somebody else to move it? Jack, do you want to move it for me?
No, I have a different...
Sorry, Mr. Chair, Madame Larouche is trying to get your attention.
Okay. Okay. This I apologize to Madame LaRouche because I can't see her from this vantage point. I still see. So where we are is she needs unanimous consent to amend her motion.
I would.
Là-dessus, je vais intervenir. Je veux.
Okay. So with that, Mr. Motts, Madame LaRouche, and Mr. Lightbound, and Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Chair. I thought I had a good idea of where we were going up until Pam's motion. Maybe I should have gone first, because now I'm really confused as to the actual timeline that we have remaining for the next 4 meetings. And I have some things to say about it. If I could just get clarity on that from the clerk, exactly what has been proposed, please.
For which, the next 4 meetings?
For the next 4 meetings, yes. That's which is Pam's motion, because I just need clarity on that.
Well, we had an agreement on 4 meetings.
Yeah, what we before Pam's motion, we had border study on Monday, Levesque on Wednesday, the following Monday, Levesque, and the following Wednesday, the IMVL study.
Point of order, Chair. That isn't fully correct.
Really?
There was the The 16th was either the Levesque study, if we hadn't finished it, or the CSC study that we were undertaking. June 21st was either Levesque or CSC as well. June 23rd, IMVE. That's the motion that was passed. So there's two other studies that are affected, the Levesque and the CSC, as well as the border.
Yes, I suppose I was not operating in the realm of miracles on CSC. So.
Well, there may be a proposal that contains some. We'll see.
Okay. Mr. Lightbound.
I'm not, Chair, I'm not, I was asking the question where I haven't made any of my statements yet that I need to make.
Sorry.
And I just, so that was the original, but Pam had just finished talking about changing that. And that's what I'm referring to. I knew what our schedule was previous. Pam just spoke about making some changes to her motion or changes to the dates and what we're going to study on those dates. That's what I'm referring to, needing clarity on before I speak to what I need to speak to.
So she was turned down.
Yeah.
She was originally taking Monday and Wednesday of next week. And then she proposed that she would take a portion of Monday.
That's what I'm referring to.
And leave the Wednesday presumably as is. But that was turned down because she didn't get unanimous consent.
Okay. All right. So I just want to say this then, and further to what I said previously about this motion that's before us that Pam originally put forward, Chair. You know, I look at this and it's so incredibly important that we hear this, but there's no action on here. Like there's no action from this motion that says what the committee is going to do with any of the information that we have or any information that we're going to gather. And what I would encourage through Joelle as the PS to public safety is to go back to the minister and say, you know what, if we want action, Canadians want action on this, and it might give us a warm feeling to have the conversation, but Canadians are looking for something to keep them safe in their community. We need to deal with this. And I would encourage the minister and the government to meet with these groups to action some things that we're not going to get action by hearing them at the committee and then not giving anything to the government to action. And that's what I'm getting at. I think, it's so critically important that we have, we hear from these groups and we try and figure out some concrete plans. But in the short term, this committee is handcuffed by time and the fact that Parliament isn't sitting for the summer to action the items that we hear. Government can. And that's what I would encourage, to be done if we want to hear on IMVE and we want to hear from the Islamic groups and from the Jewish groups on what what they're experiencing and what recommendations they would have to do. And that's my suggestion, Chair, and to Joel to maybe that's an avenue that we can actually have these groups heard, so that we can action some of those things, because what we hear now, there's no time. We're a prisoner to the time that we have left.
I think Madame LaRouche would be up next, and then Mr. Lightbound. I think that's correct.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm really trying to understand how I should be voting, so I'm trying to understand with Ms. Nava's amendment, and if it's presented differently. Just before the break, I'd asked what that would imply for the calendar and the schedule, and I was told that if we voted for this, the 14th and 16th, it would be the extremism issue. The 21st would be even 21st, 23rd, Madame Levesque. So the two studies of the last week. So I really would require some clarification of our upcoming schedule based on the motion and the amended motion before we vote. Because right now, the schedule does not at all seem to be clear.
Just for point of clarification, the only motion that's currently on the floor, the unamended motion, would replace the border study and Levesque with next week with two studies for the IMVE, and then that would presumably leave space for the Levesque study to be further heard, further dealt with on the 23rd, because we'd have one leftover space. So back to, I hope that's clarifying for you. Back to Mr. Lightbound and Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if I may say respectfully, what's before this committee is not about getting a warm feeling, as Glenn has suggested. It's about giving a voice before a parliamentary committee to two communities who've increasingly in recent years felt unsafe because we've seen a drastic rise in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. We've seen 2020 be a record year in terms of hate crimes in this country. And to me, reducing it to getting a warm feelings when this is an action that we can take as parliamentarians is offer this space for these groups to make their demands be known and be public, and what actions they'd like to see the government of Canada and the parliament take. So it's not about getting a warm feeling. It's very important that we proceed with this motion, and I failed to see really what's the issue here, given what Pam has just suggested, which is that we reduce it to one meeting, as was initially agreed, and that we just move the meeting that was planned on the 23rd to the 14th or the 16th, so next week, so that we hear these groups because of the pressing nature of this matter. So I would move to amend Pam's motion so that the session that was planned on the 23rd be moved for the week of the 14th, and that we have the border and CIJA and the Canadian, le Conseil canadien des musulmans qui viennent présenter au comité dans la semaine du 14. Sorry, I just switched back to French. It's my mind gets a little confused between French and English at times. So that we would have one meeting, 90 minutes for CIJA and the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and then 30 minutes to draft a motion for this committee that reports back to the House what we've heard from these two groups. I think that's very important. It changes nothing to what's planned ahead of us. And the only thing it changes is the order. And I just failed to see how we can't agree on this. So I would move to amend the motion, and I hope the analysts can work something out of what I just said. Thank you.
Okay, so that motion is properly moved and would have to be voted on before with the main motion, but with that, I think it's Mr. Harris, and then Damoff, and then Stubbs.
Thank you. I would agree with most of what Mr. Lightbound said. Yes, we have heard voices in recent weeks, in fact, of a climate of fear amongst the Jewish community in Canada, and has been voiced publicly as a result of recent events and the rise of anti-Semitic acts, as well as clearly since the events in London, a expression of real fear from the Muslim community, and a call for action to get results. And I support the idea of having a 90-minute session where we could hear from each of those groups, aimed at expressing their concerns, and also specific recommendations regarding solutions, concrete actions that we could then have a half an hour may well be enough if some thought is given to it in advance of crafting a motion that would be referred to the House. I think we can do that. But there's also several other motions before this committee that have to do with ongoing studies. One is relation to the Bastarache report. That was a notice of motion has been given. There's also a motion in relation to there's a notice of motion I think has gone in today in relation to dealing with the Levesque study. And there's a motion that I have put forward, given notice of motion regarding with the study that we were actually supposed to be starting today, which seems to have been forgotten about, despite the fact that we have witnesses waiting. So I don't think we're being fair to the balance of our calendar. And I would point out that there were 3 days were offered for the CSE study that are of great importance. So we have 5 witnesses waiting to talk about it today. That we can't ignore that, I don't think. There's a method suggested of dealing with the Levesque study that we can debate, and we may pass a version of that so that we can complete that study. So I would prefer that if we were going to interrupt our schedule, with respect to the Levesque study, that we still try to complete that and do that by potentially considering those motions, and instead of starting at something that we haven't even begun, the border study, which I think was of great interest to Madame Michaud. I don't know if there's still the same level of interest on that point, but there is a lot of interest on the Bastarache report and a motion before the committee. There's interest on the CSC thing, then there's witnesses waiting to testify, and there is a proposal, I believe, from the Conservatives as to how to deal with the report for Levesque, and I think we should deal with those next week as well. So I'm not in favor of the motion of Mr. Lightbound if it merely deals with only one aspect of what's before us.
Madame Damoff, Madame Stubbs.
Thanks, Chair. I'm actually surprised that we're still talking about this. And I can't tell you how disappointed I am to hear comments like the calendar is coming to, we're running out of time. There was a family in London, Ontario, that ran out of time and were killed. And, you know, I watched the vigil last night, and I listened to every single leader of the Conservative Party, the Bloc Québécois, the Liberal Party, the New Democratic Party speak passionately. And the Bloc leader was in London as well, even though he didn't speak. All of them talked about working across party lines. I watched that vigil last night, and I felt that it was urgent for the Public Safety Committee to do work on this. We had already committed to a study on ideologically motivated violent extremism. We had already decided to do that. I listened to someone from the National Council of Canadian Muslims talk about how they wanted action. And I felt like this was something that we could do as parliamentarians. I also find it offensive to say that we as parliamentarians don't have a role. And I'm sorry, I believe that we do. I believe we can give these people a voice. And I would hope that we could vote on this. I am prepared to agree to Joelle's amendment. I've accepted to reduce this to one meeting, although I would have preferred to have two. And I think that this is something that we need to do urgently. And this talk about running out of time, I just think is terrible. And I think we should vote on this. And if people don't feel that this is an important issue, then shame on them.
Stubbs, Kara, Motz.
Thanks, Chair. So I am wholeheartedly amenable to Joelle's suggestion here, which I think might come to a solution that we all want, which is to hear from representatives of the NCCM and CJA about their recommendations to government. But as Jack and Glenn have said, also to see government then act efficiently and expeditiously on the actions that they can take. My only concern, and Joelle, I don't know, maybe you can help sort of guarantee this, or whatever wording might be necessary to do it, is as Jack has articulated, I just think it is also imperative that we complete and do our report on Levesque. I'm sure that Joelle feels the same way too, given that young woman's death. So I think we need to figure out a way to be able to complete that and report out on that work. And then you all know that I do believe we need to make a recommendation to report out on the Bastarache report, about which I think we all also share the same concern and desire to see actual consequences, support for victims, consequences for offenders. So too with this heinous crime in London. So I think Joelle might be on the track here to helping us get to a solution. I just want to make sure that that whichever way we have to as a committee, ensure that we do complete these other items that we're working on.
Point of order, Chair.
Yes.
I think we're seem to be, doing something that's contrary to what the committee actually wants. Everybody is agreed that we have the priority given to what Pam has suggested. The issue is where that and you know, I resent the idea that certainly I have no interest. I want to hear from both of these individuals, both of these communities, and make some positive recommendations. The question is
no,
other things before the committee.
Okay, that's more of a point of debate than it is a point of order, but I congratulate you on your subtleties. Colleagues, I would dearly love to call this question, especially since we've got witnesses waiting. And so I see 3 hands up. I would love to call a question on Mr. Lightbound's amendment and then the main motion. So if I could urge people to keep their comments to a minimum so that we can at least hear what our very patient witnesses have to say. Madame Carroll.
Thank you, Chair. I just briefly just wanted to comment on Mr. Mott's comments and echo what both Joelle and Pam said. And I think it's important to recognize the role that this committee plays, the members on this committee play. Government certainly has a job to do, and government has taken action on listing of the terrorist groups and is taking action. But what, you know, as Pam said, like what we saw yesterday was all parties coming together at the vigil saying that we must work together. And we already have a study before us that we were studying on IMVE. We heard just the week before about, you know, from witnesses about this climate of hate and rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And committees have a role to play. Listen to these groups, and as this is the most important threat right now to Canada, as we heard. And I think it's truly incumbent upon all of us to hear from these groups, give them the space that's needed, and make recommendations to the government before the House rises. I just don't understand, Mr. Chair, like why we're even debating this. I really thought this would have been a unanimous, you know, support on this motion. It's not a new study; it's something that we're already studying. So I just hope that we can get it done.
Mr. Motts.
Thank you, Chair. I want to clarify a couple things. First, Joel, thanks for the amendment to the motion. That is something I certainly would support and do support. I want to make it very, very clear that my statements at the front end were this is a critically important study, a critically important issue that we have to deal with, and it's increasing in this country, and it's completely unacceptable. These groups who wish to come as witnesses, they want a voice, they deserve a voice, but what they need is action. And that's what my point was. And that's the point that I will stick to. This government can action things that this committee may not be able to in a timely way. And that's my point. I'll stick to that. These groups want action. Joel, you said it yourself. Kamal, you said it yourself. These groups need action. They have to have a voice. This committee is a vehicle for that, but so is directly the Public Safety Department. The minister can meet with these groups and action some of these items immediately, faster than this committee can. That's what these groups need. And anything short of that is unacceptable in my books. It's this sort of crime needs to stop, obviously, but a study here will only, it doesn't solve the problem immediately. And that's my point. And if it was misunderstood, I apologize for that. But action is what's required, not just words.
Hey, Mr. Lightbound, Mr. Harris.
I'll be brief, but just to answer to Shannon, I think it's fundamental that this committee provides its perspective on the tragic death of Marlène Lévesque. However, the amended motion does not impact whatsoever the number of meetings that we had planned to work on the Lévesque report. So just to be clear. And then I would hope that the debate collapses soon enough. Thank you.
Well, we're hoping that Mr. Harris is the last word here.
Well, first of all, I just want to say that this debate is not about, from my point of view, whether we immediately hear from the SECU organization and the Canadian Muslim Association as well, which we should do as soon as possible for the length of time that it takes. And I think it's been proposed that we do that for one meeting with a focus on concrete action that this committee can recommend to government that ought to be taken immediately to address not only the concern, but also solutions that we hope will help. And I think that has to happen, and that should happen right away. I regret that we've ended up with a motion that ends up, I think, disturbing three other studies of this committee without an opportunity to talk about that, other than to be accused of not being interested in dealing with the main question that's before us. So it's made it impossible to actually have that debate. I guess we may as well go ahead and vote and let us get on with the CSC study, which seems to have been thrown out the window by this. And we don't, unless we do something else next week, have an opportunity to deal with the motions that deal with those three studies.
Okay, I want to call a question, but I want to make sure that everybody knows what the question is. So I'll ask the clerk to read back the amendment.
May I trouble Mr. Lightbound to kind of clarify his amendment to make sure I have it correct?
Okay.
Oui, je vais juste reprendre le texte de la motion.
Yes, I'd like to find the text of the motion to try to make it intelligible. That pursuant to a motion passed on May 5th, 2021, that the Public Safety Committee continue its study on ideologically motivated violent extremism, that one meeting occur or be moved up during the week of June 14th, and that the National Council of Canadian Muslims and the CIJA, I don't know what it is in French, but the committee invite the National Council of Canadian Muslims and the Centre for Israel and Jewish Affairs to appear as witnesses during the week of June 14th, either June 14th or 16th, for a meeting.
The terms of the motion, or the amendment at least.
We have a recorded vote, Chair.
We can have a recorded vote. Okay. Mr. Clerk, call the vote.
So the question is on the amendment. The amendment of Mr. Lightbound. Mr. Lightbound.
En faveur. Oh, sorry, my camera was off. En faveur, Monsieur Greffier.
Ms. Damoff.
In favor.
Mr. Fisher.
En faveur, Monsieur Greffier.
Ms. Kara.
Yes.
Mr. Bratina.
In favor.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Favor.
Mr. Motz.
Fully support.
Ms. Stubbs.
In favor.
Mr. Van Popta.
In favor.
Madame Larouche.
En faveur.
Mr. Harris.
100% in favor of the motion read by the clerk.
Mr. Chair, yeas pour 11, nays contre 0.
So that would then put the motion as amended to the committee. Do we wish to have another recorded vote?
Yes, please, Chair.
The question is on the motion as amended. Ms. Damoff.
Could you just read that? Sorry, Chair. Could you have that motion read as amended, please? Is that the one that Joel just did?
We just unanimously agreed to the amendment. Now
Yes.
that amends the main motion. And so now we have to vote on the main motion as amended.
Seems to have replaced the main motion.
No,
that's what I thought.
I don't know whether it replaces it. It's an amendment, not a replacement. So, Mr. Clerk, so read, if you will, the motion as amended.
The motion as amended. So that pursuant to a motion passed on May 5th, 2021, that the Public Safety Committee continue its study on ideologically motivated violent extremism, that one meeting occur on the week of June 14th, and that the committee invite the National Council of Canadian Muslims and the Centre for Israel and Jewish Affairs to appear as witnesses.
Okay, there's been a request for recorded vote, so.
The question is on the motion as amended. Ms. Damoff.
Yes.
Mr. Fisher.
Yes.
Ms. Kara.
Yes.
Mr. Bratina,
Yes, in favor.
Monsieur Lightbound,
Oui.
Mr. Dreeshen,
Yes.
Mr. Motts,
Yes.
Ms. Stubbs,
Yes.
Mr. Van Popta,
Yes.
Madame Larouche,
Oui.
Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, yeas pour 11, nays contre 0.
Thank you. Clerk, could you advise me as to how much time we have left for this meeting?
We have about 55 minutes.
Okay. Now, I am cognizant that Mr. Harris had, did you deal with your motion, or you had, I know you wanted my attention. I can't remember what it was for.
Well, there was a motion on the floor from the notice of motion had been given regarding the disclosure of documents made available to the committee on June the 3rd. That motion is now been given proper notice. It relates to the business of this particular study, and I'd like to move that the be a public release of all documents that were made available to the committee on June the 3rd, 2021, pursuant to the motion adopted by the committee on May 5th, 2021, regarding Correctional Services Canada's transition to structured intervention units, and that all additional documents regarding the same motion be made public as they are provided to the committee. That's been circulated in both languages, sir, and it's 24 or 48 hours notice. And the documents that have been available, they're redacted in the sense of privacy considerations. Are no names are used, so the names are protected. So they're public information that would be available in any event to an ATIP. So I think we can go ahead and release them.
So the clerk is asking me by public or on the web, or does that equal to be on the website?
It's on the website. Yeah,
Okay.
that's what, as we've done in other committees, that you just
Okay.
put them on the website and available on the website.
Okay. Hopefully this can be a relatively quick motion, but Madame Damoff, wait.
I was just going to say, I think when they're tabled with the committee, they're normally public anyway, Chair, so we don't have a problem with that at all.
Any other interventions? Shannon.
Okay, so Chair, following all of that, can you just confirm for us then, I think that we still have outstanding motions we need to deal with. And so when will we do that next week and at which meeting?
Excellent question to which I don't have a very good answer. Your intervention, as welcome as it might be, is probably not in order, given that we are debating Mr. Harris's motion. Any other interventions on the motion itself? Seeing none, those in favor of the motion? Okay, any opposed? Okay, that disposes of the motion. I would dearly love to get to these witnesses. And maybe I'll have some clarification for your inquiry by this time next, or even earlier than, I'd like to be able to have a work plan of some kind or another to deal with the various issues that are in front of us. So if we can undertake that, then, and I'm sure you'll hold my feet to the fire. So with that, we have whatever time we have left. Mr. Clerk, if you could, I'm assuming that the witnesses are standing by. And we will have very limited time. I don't see the witnesses. Oh, I see Madame Coyle, and I see Mr. Dr. Dube and Dr. Sprott. So, again, how much time do we have left, Mr. Clark?
We have until 7:10.
7:10 and it's 6:19, so roughly 50 minutes. So I think to be fair to the witnesses who have been extremely generous and patient, that we ask them to make their presentations, and then we'll have to figure out how we go to questions after that. So in no particular order, I see Dr. Sprott and Dr. Dube. I believe Dr. Sprott wishes to go first, and I believe each of you are going to do 4 minutes. Is that correct? Okay. Dr. Sprott, please, 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us to speak to you about Correctional Services Canada's structured intervention units. To date, we have written 4 reports using CSC's data on the operation of these new SIUs. And before highlighting any of our findings, it's important to know from the outset that none of what we found could predominantly be attributed to COVID. These issues are
Has Dr. Sprott frozen?
Have I frozen?
You froze. I'm sorry.
Am I unfrozen?
You are unfrozen now. If you could just back up, say 30 seconds and go from there, please.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So to date, we have written 4 reports using CSC's data. None of our findings can be predominantly attributed to COVID. It's important to understand that these problems are pre-existing. In our first report, released almost 8 months ago now, we identified some very serious issues. While there's enormous provincial variation or regional variation.
You froze again. Dr. Sprott, you froze again.
Oh no, am I back?
You're back
Okay.
in the land of the virtual. So my suggestion would be, let's go over to Dr. Dube, and then I'll try to come back to you, and by some magic or another, maybe that time will be, you won't freeze quite so often. So let me go at that again. Dr. Dube, we'll give you 4 minutes. Take yourself off mute will be a good start. Excellent, thank you.
The presentation from Professor Sprott was really to give you an overview of some of the findings that we had in the 4 reports that we wrote using Correctional Service of Canada data. Rather than my describing what she, I hope, will be able to describe, what I'd like to concentrate on is the issue of the oversight of our system of solitary confinement. One body said to be providing oversight are the independent external decision makers, or excuse me, or IEDMs. In our 4th report, we document using CSC data that there are prisoners who are ordered by the IEDMs to be released from the SIU, but who remain in SIUs for at least 61 days after the case is referred for review. And we report that there are others who have been in the SIUs for long periods of time without review. As you know, if you look carefully at stays in SIUs, you will see that many of the stays fall into internationally recognized categories of solitary confinement and torture. I find it disturbing that in Canada, we could have a discussion of why the rate of torture in CSC facilities in the Pacific region is so much higher than in Ontario. I never thought that in my career as a criminologist, I would be comparing torture rates in institutions under the control of the Government of Canada. This is happening while oversight is being provided by these external decision makers. But let's talk about another form of oversight. I chaired the SIU Implementation Advisory Panel established in mid-2019. We were a volunteer panel. In order to get an overview of what was happening, we asked CSC in November 2019, before the SIUs opened, to provide us with certain administrative data that they routinely collect. In February 2020, we were told that CSC might not give us these data. No adequate justification was given. Only when the panel released its first and only report in August 2020, after its mandate had expired, did anything happen. To his credit, Minister Blair at that point apparently told CSC to provide me with the data. The panel had the data that the panel had requested. By then, the panel did not exist. Professor Sprott and I received these data on 30th of September 2020. We went to work finding out what these data told us about the operation of the SIUs. We provided a draft of our report to CSC for comment 16 days later. We released it publicly at the end of October. Professor Sprott, if she is able to get back on, will tell you some of the findings. But in our report, we were influenced by a statistician who suggested that in policy areas like this, the motto should be that in God we trust, all others must bring data. Our 4 reports total 111 pages, and they contain 87 tables of data, most of which provide details of the serious problems in the operation of the SIUs. We trust the data. We're skeptical of those in CSC who have questioned the validity of our research findings that are based on CSC data, but then these same people fail to provide any evidence of their own. We need to have adequate oversight of CSC's operations of the SIUs. Let's consider the basis for the decisions made by these IEDMs. They are almost completely dependent on CSC accounts of individual cases. We have at this point no information about what they base their decisions on, or even what information they are given by CSC. We're not criticizing the IEDMs as individuals. It's a problem of the structure in which these people are being required to make decisions. But we also do know that there's significant and substantial variability in the pattern of decisions made by these independent decision makers. You are much more likely to be ordered to be released from the SIU by some of these IDMs than by others. Our 4th report provides a substantial amount of data demonstrating that the IEDM system is not adequate. But we also need broader oversight of penitentiaries to determine whether solitary confinement is being practiced elsewhere in the institutions, not just in the SIUs. Remember, solitary confinement is a practice, not a place. Prisons are.
Can I interrupt you? You roared past the 4 minutes, and I apologize.
Okay.
Should we go back to Dr. Sprott?
Yes, let's do that.
And we'll get her hopefully properly started, and hopefully not frozen. The tech team says something about closing a bunch of apps. I just got a note. Here says your connection is good, but they're asking you to close as many apps as possible. So anyway, this is called multitasking, Dr. Sprott. If I could ask you to do 4 minutes, please.
Oh yeah, sure. I can be quicker than that. I'll pick up from where Professor Dube was talking about some of the disturbing findings that we have found. And in our 3rd report, released almost 4 months ago now, we found that 28% of stays in these SIUs fell within the internationally defined Mandela rules as solitary.
Oh my.
You may have to lose her video, Chair.
Yeah.
Perfect. You know what? I'll do that.
Yeah, okay.
So another 10% of these stays constituted what would be internationally described as torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. This means that overall, 38% of SIU stays can be described as being solitary confinement or torture. I'm not sure if that perhaps requires repeating, but in Canada, 38% of SIU stays would be internationally defined as solitary confinement or torture. And you might have thought when calculating.
Okay, here we go again.
Have I?
You're frozen. I think that the best way to handle this is I'll go on to Ms. Coyle and ask her for 7 minutes And because we are under kind of a time pressure here, that we'll ask you to respond to questions as they arise. But Ms. Coyle, you have 7 minutes.
Wow, thank you. I I was looking forward to hearing the rest of Dr. Sprott's testimony. So
Yeah.
I'm very grateful to be here today with all of you. It's a pleasure to see you all, and I'm grateful that you're working on this topic. You may know about the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, for which I'm the executive director. I'm going to be referring to my notes if you see me looking to the side. Just in the interest of time, I want to make sure that everyone here is aware that we work very closely with those who are serving federal sentences in all of the prisons designated for women across the country. And you know that we've been asked to speak on 3 issues today that are impacting federally incarcerated people. And while they're disparate in some ways, I think these issues are connected by power structures that are inherent in the prisons and a lack of transparency, which we were hearing about from Dr. Dube and Dr. Sprott, which are often facilitated by a lack of data collection and reporting. But I will begin today by speaking about the issue of sexual violence and coercion. I believe all the members of this committee will have received our brief ahead of this meeting, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I really do hope that you read it. The women, non-binary, trans, and two-spirit people in federal prisons designated for women, as you all know, are some of the most under-resourced, underserved, and underprotected people in our communities. They are people who are survivors of trauma and abuse, which is a fact that the Correctional Service of Canada has acknowledged and reported on, but we cannot underscore it enough in this context. I'm sure you're also all aware, because he appeared before you, the Office of the Correctional Investigator released their annual report in October 2020, and it included a national investigation into sexual coercion and sexual violence, and it was entitled, very appropriately, A Culture of Silence. We welcomed their initiative in taking the first ever systemic examination of the issue of sexual coercion and violence in Canadian federal prisons. And we agree that Canada is behind when it comes to addressing sexual violence behind bars. However, while the investigation includes some anecdotal evidence around incidents of sexual violence and coercion involving the actions of CSC staff toward prisoners, this was not the focus of their investigation, and it is the focus of mine, because the inherent power imbalance between a correctional officer and a prisoner cannot be overstated, and these harms must be included in further research and action. We've been made aware over the years of numerous incidents of CSC employees engaging in sexual coercion or violence against prisoners in the prisons designated for women. You can read the details of some of the reported incidents in the brief that I referenced earlier, and it is extremely concerning to us. We also recognize that much of what we are sharing is anecdotal, and herein lies the problem. We're unable to provide a clear picture of sexual violence and coercion perpetrated by CSC staff in the federal prisons designated for women, because further accurate and comprehensive data is not collected on this matter. As you know, in the report, A Culture of Silence, the OCI found that CSC does not publicly report on this problem, does not collect, record, or track statistics, and has never conducted research in the area. And in this, I am reminded, as I'm sure all of you are, of the power dynamics and the culture of silence that has been exposed in the current investigation into sexual misconduct in the Canadian military. So it begs the question, is this a clear example of apathy on the part of CSC or a concerted effort to use a lack of transparency to skirt accountability? And so far, I've touched on the unsanctioned sexual violence and coercion that happens in the prisons designated for women. However, there are also ways in which CSC sanctions sexual assault, namely through the use of strip searches. It is well documented that strip searches are traumatizing and harmful. The Supreme Court of Canada has described the practice of strip searching as inherently humiliating and degrading. And for those who have experienced sexual violence, strip searches are experienced as an act of sexualized violence. The OCI has also found that by definition, a random strip search any legal constitutional standard of suspicion, reasonableness, or necessity. It may not surprise you that CSC does not track, or it does not publicly report on the searches meeting the stated objective of preventing contraband from entering the prisons. And so to conclude my remarks on this issue, the power structures inherent in institutions like prisons and the lack of transparency related to data keeping have resulted in opportunities for people to be further harmed by sexual violence while in prison. I'm speaking very quickly. I'm trying to keep to my time.
2 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So now to my comments on COVID-19. During COVID-19, there has been less CSC oversight than ever, making prisoners even more vulnerable to abuse. This lack of oversight, we believe, has contributed to unacceptable and unlawful conditions of confinement during COVID-19 that were certainly not contemplated or foreseen by the courts at the time of sentencing of most of the prisoners. And from the very beginning of the pandemic, CAFES, our organization, joined the calls of prisoners, prisoners' families, prisoner rights groups, academics, politicians, lawyers, healthcare experts, and other NGOs like the John Howard Society, who I believe you'll hear from in the next hour or perhaps next half an hour. We were all calling to depopulate the prisons as quickly as possible. This was following the advice of the World Health Organization and actions taken by other states to keep people in prison safe. These calls were not heeded, and it resulted in prisoners being kept in torturous conditions of confinement and further exposed to the deadly virus. We have documented conditions of confinement which have been implemented at different times for varying lengths of time throughout the last year and a half, which I can't go into because of time, but I will answer any questions you may have about them. But a commonality in the conditions of restriction is this restriction of access to mechanisms that support the well-being of prisoners, their timely release, and CSC oversight. And we are concerned that the conditions under which people have been held have not been to protect their health, but rather to ease the operation and the operational convenience of CSC. All of this could have been prevented should the prisons have taken the calls for depopulation seriously and taken swift action. CSC's operational restrictions cannot and must not be downloaded to restrict the rights and the well-beings of prisoners. And so finally, to the structured intervention units, I'll try to be very brief as you have the experts in the room here today on the lack of transparency, clarity, and reporting, and we support all the findings of the reports put out by Dr. Dube and Dr. Sprott. Since the changes to the CCRA through Bill C-83, we have observed the unconstitutional practice of segregation, often colloquially referred to as solitary confinement, is ongoing. Prisoners are still experiencing the same human rights violations as they were prior to the court rulings of 2019. And in addition, CSC employs... If you could
just wind it up.
I'll wrap up. This is it. I'm wrapping up.
Okay, please.
CSC employs a myriad of other segregation methods to isolate prisoners for unregulated periods of time. I think this is what Dr. Dube was referring to. And so I just want to say we must continue to be guided by the principle that human rights are not just abstract or theoretical. We cannot simply say that someone has a right without then developing and ensuring a functioning process that enables them to access and protect that right.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'm in your hands. Normally we would go to a round of questions and then call in the other two witnesses, but what I'm afraid of is that the other two witnesses may not ever be heard from in the time constraints that we have. So I just want to see whether there's an appetite to call on the other two witnesses now and then have one round of questions because we do have a hard stop at 7:10. I believe that's correct. Is that true, Mr. Clerk?
Yes, that is true.
That's true. So my thought would be, Mr. Harris?
Yes, I would agree that we should call in the other witnesses, but I would also like to move a motion that we continue this study on the week of June 14th.
Okay, well, we're going to have to deal with that. If we're going to deal with this at all today, get these witnesses, we're not going to be able to move deal with the motion. So even though the motion is in order, I'm going to, if Mr. Clerk, if you could admit the other two witnesses, that would be appreciated.
Mr. Chair, may I recommend that you suspend for 2 minutes while I proceed to sound checks with the witnesses?
Oh, okay.
Point of order, Chair. Are we going to? Can we deal with that motion during this meeting at some point? Because it's relevant.
You know, I'm just
running.
I'm just blown. It's in order. It's relevant to the study. The concern is that we're managing. We're just running through time.
We can't
So-
we can't deal with it while the sound checks are going on, I take it.
No, I don't think so. So if can we move those sound checks ahead? Unsuspend. And I'll ask Ms. Latimer for her 7 minutes and then Mr. Wilkins for his 7 minutes, and then we'll see where that leaves us as far as members asking questions. So Ms. Latimer, 7
Thank
minutes.
you, Chair and committee members. It's good to be here, and there are very few words to describe the current state of corrections in Canada today. Crisis, lawless, unaccountable, tragic would be some of them. In my 30 years as a lawyer, I have never seen failings of this magnitude. Let's start with COVID. In March 2020, CSE assured stakeholders that it was, quote, prepared to handle any cases of influenza or other respiratory illnesses, including COVID-19, unquote. Reliance on its influenza strategy soon proved no match for a virus that we knew was far more contagious and deadly than the flu. Epidemiologists from around the world were calling for the safety population of prisons, particularly for those who were medically vulnerable. But this did not happen in the federal corrections system. Instead, CSC chose to combat COVID with extreme isolation. No activity, no family, no books, no programming, no contact, complete isolation. Inadequate consideration was given to the severe mental health impacts these lockdowns would cause. CSE might claim that these measures were required by public health officials, but ultimately CSE was the decision maker, and it should have known that Canadian courts have found that this type of extreme, cruel isolation violates prisoners' rights and is prohibited by international human rights documents. While CSC assured us everything was under control, its own records show quite the opposite. December 2020, correspondence from the warden at SAS Penn shows that prisoners had suicide and starvation pacts. Correctional officers kept COVID positive prisoners in the general population and simply hung flammable shower curtains around their cells to separate them from non-COVID prisoners. This was a formula for spreading the virus. On December the 24th, the same institution said, the health and safety of our employees, offenders, and the public remains our top priority during this public health pandemic. Further inconsistencies are revealed in internal documents, from wardens telling correctional officers to ignore the advice of health authorities, to wardens telling prisoners that correctional officers do not need to wear masks. We have lots of documented inconsistencies that we would be happy to share. Prisoners were generally not consulted about what steps should be taken to protect their health. When protests arose, usually about correctional officers failing to wear PPE, significant force was brought to bear, concussion grenades in one case and rubber bullets in another. The correctional investigator in his second update on COVID in June 2020 stated, quote, some of these restrictions reach beyond measures or controls contemplated in either domestic or international law. Public health emergencies must be managed within a legal framework. Rights need to be respected and restored, unquote. I agree with Dr. Zinger. Rights were violated and legal limits were exceeded in CSC's approach to the pandemic. In the end, COVID-19 technically decimated the federal prison population, with more than 10% contracting the disease, 6 deaths, and unquantified enduring health complications. The structured interventions units. The Liberal Party made a campaign commitment to implement Ashley Smith coroner's recommendation that included limiting solitary confinement to 15 days. In 2018, the administrative segregation was ruled unconstitutional in Canada as violating charter rights. In 2019, we were told that abusive solitary confinement had ended and was being replaced by structured intervention units, where prisoners would be out of their cells for 4 hours a day with 2 hours of meaningful human contact. As we learned from Dr. Dube and Dr. Sprott, this is not happening. Among the significant problems that have been identified, the structured intervention units are not delivering the measures the government promised that they would, and 10% of the placements in structured intervention units experience the same prolonged solitary confinement condition that the courts found violated charter rights and are defined in international human rights documents as a form of torture. Yes, Canadians are being tortured by state officials. Minister Blair accepted these findings before this committee, yet the government has not directed CSC to stop placing people in solitary confinement for more than 15 consecutive days. Section 4 of the Department of Justice Act requires the Minister of Justice to see that the administration of public affairs is consistent with the laws. The Department of Justice has lost litigation and class action lawsuits on the basis that prolonged solitary confinement violates prisoners' charter rights. The publication of the Dube-Sprott report last February should have signaled to the Minister of Justice or his staff that CSC was not administering public affairs in a manner consistent with the Charter. He has not acted on his statutory obligations. This tolerance for the torture of Canadian prisoners should shock the conscience of us all and needs to stop immediately. I'm delighted that the committee has agreed that the disclosures from CSC that it is required will be made public. I think there is a profound public interest to know how this dire situation arose and has been allowed to persist, why 44% of SIU prisoners are Indigenous and 18% are Black, why Canada chooses to ignore international human rights standards like the Nelson Mandela rules, yet calls on other countries like China to respect those rules in relation to the treatment of the two Michaels. Whether, as many feared, the SIUs are simply solitary confinement renamed. As the Commissioner herself said in response to the Dube-Sprott finding of torture in the SIUs, quote, I always stress with staff the importance of speaking of structured intervention units and not administrative segregation, solitary confinement. Whatever it is labeled, wherever it is occurring in the federal correction system, keeping prisoners in their cells for more than 22 hours without meaningful human contact is solitary confinement, and such confinement for more than 15 days is prohibited as a form of torture and a charter violation. It must end. Violence. Regarding violence, and I know I'm running short on time, so I'm going to be quick.
30 seconds, please.
Images, I think, are more powerful, and I would encourage everyone to take a look at the recent released video of the Black prisoner at Millhaven who has been assaulted at Millhaven Institution. I'd be happy to answer any questions on that. In conclusion, I think the failure of the Correctional Service of Canada to respect the spirit of the Charter and the findings against prolonged solitary confinement and the international minimum standards that prohibit the form of confinement is shocking. While this confinement has been worsened by COVID, not even a pandemic can justify the rights abuses we have seen over the last year. I hope that this committee will support the public's petition for a judicial inquiry into this fiasco, which the government is required to answer by June the 26th. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Latimer. Mr. Wilkins, you have 7 minutes, please.
Well, thank you and good evening, Mr. Chair and the members of this committee. I'm Jeff Wilkins, the National President for the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers. I'm going to focus my opening statements more on the first part of what the committee is looking into, and that's the current situation in federal prisons in relation to correctional service response to COVID-19, but more than happy to answer any questions that you may have with regard to the structured intervention units or the reports of sexual coercion and violence in Canadian prisons. But I first like to express my pride in representing such an incredible group of professionals. The Correctional Officers of Canada, who have worked through this pandemic with pride, who have sacrificed their own health and safety in their mandate to protect the Canadian public, and who are all too often unrecognized for the vitally important role that they play in the criminal justice system. And over the last 15 months, our members have been on the front lines, battling this pandemic, performing the duties of all first responder groups. Arguably, one of the most dangerous occupations in the country is that of a correctional officer. And the global pandemic only increased the danger for our members. While countless public servants were sent home and workplaces were closed, our members continued to don their uniform and enter the institutions. Over the last 15 months, there have been significant outbreaks within institutions in every region except for the Atlantic region. In recent statistics, it is known that there have been approximately 5,000 reported cases of COVID among federal public servants of the core public administration. Correctional officers represent nearly 450 of those cases, meaning that our members represent approximately 10% of reported cases in the entire public service. And that's interesting when you calculate that our membership only represents 2% of the core public administration. Furthermore, our members were unable to telework, so our rates of infection were for the most part a result of work. The waves of this pandemic resulted in a turbulent wake that some institutions are going to feel the effects of for years to come. We saw in cases the workforce of correctional officers depleted in some of our institutions to about 30%. Forced overtime became a reality for our members in many of our institutions. The pandemic choked the induction training programs for new correctional officers entering the service, and just when that relief was needed. When restrictions began to lift after the first wave, the service scrambled to try to put on as many correctional officer training programs as they could. However, they were still behind, and our members will face another summer where forced overtime will be a reality. UCOSAC CSN was encouraged at the beginning of this pandemic that virtually all provinces moved to strengthen the front lines by providing a hazard allowance, while also creating and promoting morally inspiring messages about those working on the front lines. For those to step into the line of fire, it is both important to reward that bravery and provide messages of thanks, respect, and encouragement. Rightfully, frontline workers have been portrayed as heroes across this country, and I would like to highlight to this committee that the members of UCOSAC CSN, Canada's federal correctional officers, are heroes as well. The heroes I represent have not made the spotlight of recognition. Nowhere have I witnessed a message of thanks for the correctional officer. Since the beginning of this pandemic, UCOSAC CSN has been asking about the recognition in the form of a hazard allowance from this government to help encourage and recognize the work being performed for the public. And unfortunately, the government has not moved in the direction to recognize this. However, this government does remain committed to subsidizing the provinces to recognize the essential workers in their jurisdiction. And for the members of UCOSAC CSN, this failure is demoralizing. This pandemic has brought on many challenges for corrections, to say the least. The very nature of a penitentiary is to provide control by restricting movements, associations, while working to rehabilitate the population and become law-abiding citizens. Ironically, the way to control the spread of a pandemic in civil society is also to restrict movements and associations. Our institutions are essentially communal living facilities, not much different from long-term care homes. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it's how quickly the virus can spread in places where there is an inability to create individual space. Of course, the population in our structured intervention and SIUs have also been affected. The SIU model, which is replaced segregation in November 2019, can only be assessed based on the 4 months it was running before the pandemic took hold in March. Though the members of UCOSAC CSN and other institutional staff have worked tirelessly to meet the mandate set forth in the CCRA, it has proven extremely difficult with the necessary institutional restrictions. UCOSAC CSN has been vocal on many fronts with our employer as well as the government throughout this pandemic. We have raised and debated everything from personal protective equipment, leave restrictions, institutional routine change, risk mitigation strategies, vaccination priority, hazard pay, and now obviously the work being done to resume to normal routine. As COVID fades into our history, we'll always need to be aware of the devastation that comes from with a pandemic of this magnitude and prepared for a future crisis. Coming out of this pandemic, proper attention needs to be given to the mental health of our first responders and essential workers who have made sacrifices for the public. Essentially, a battle was waged against this virus in March 2020, and all those who have been on the front line, as well as those aiding to stop the spread by following public health orders, are tired physically and mentally. Mental health will need to be on the forefront of any agenda moving forward. And I thank you for the opportunity to make this opening statement, and I welcome any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkins. Colleagues, we have about 15 minutes left before our hard stop. We're only going to be able to do one round of questions. I'm proposing that it be 4 minutes for each party, starting with Mr. Van Popta, and then I see it was scheduled to be Ms. Damoff, but I'm assuming Madame Kara is taking her place. And I see Madame Normandine is in. Welcome to the committee. And then to finish up, Mr. Harris. So with that, 4 minutes, Mr. Van Popta.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being with us here today and being patient with us. And thank you for your evidence. It was really quite shocking, particularly to hear about so many of our inmates and structural intervention units not coming within the Mandela guidelines. I'm really quite shocked about that. That 33% would be come under the definition of torture. So I think my question would be to Dr. Dube, first of all. You had stated in your evidence that you had waited a long time for data from CSC, but it finally did come. How reliable is that data? Is it, and what is the integrity of it?
Well, these are administrative data, so they're the basic ongoing records that CSC has of all prisoners, including those in structured intervention units. Any administrative data that I've worked on in the last 50 years has errors in it, but there's no reason to believe that the errors would be in any particular direction. So we found some things which were obviously errors, but the story that they tell is consistent, and it's consistent across time and across locations. I mean, you can see certain things that are errors, but we have confidence in those. And among other things, the Correctional Service of Canada is required by law to keep these data. So that this is nothing new for them. My suspicion is that they simply didn't like what those data told us.
And that was the cause for their delaying getting the data to you, do you think?
Cause of getting the delay of the delay was caused because they didn't want to give us the data. They didn't know at that point what the data really showed, but they told me on the phone in February of 2020 that they weren't sure that they were going to give us the data because they didn't think that we needed the data. It was an absolutely astonishing thing for them to say to us.
Thank you for that. That is quite astonishing. So the last part of it passed Bill C-83, which was to get rid of solitary confinement and move over to structured intervention units. Was there more than just a change in format? Was there a substantive improvement at all?
The simple answer to that, based on data, excuse me, is that we don't really know. And the reason for that is that the data that we have start at the time that the SIU started on the 30th of November 2019. But certainly what we can say is that the practices that the bill which established the SIUs was supposed to abolish did not work, that those practices still exist. And just to respond to something else that was said by another witness, these problems existed before COVID. There is no way under the sun that you could blame the problems that we have described on COVID.
All right, I thank you. I think the other witness said that maybe it was worse because of COVID, but not necessarily caused by COVID. So,
well, our data would suggest otherwise. Our data would suggest that the problem was fairly consistent. There was variation across institutions and variation on some of the measures. But if you looked at it, it would be hard to say that the problems that we've identified are COVID-related problems.
Good, thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Van Popta, you got 8 seconds, and
I will concede that to the chair then.
Thank you. Madame Kara, 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all our witnesses for being here. And I first just want to apologize for all the wait that you had to wait. And I wish I could ask you all questions, and thank you for your testimonies. But Ms. Cole, maybe I'll start with you. I wanted to talk to you about data collection. We know there's a serious problem in our correctional service system as it relates to sexual coercion and violence. There are certainly many layers to that problem, the reporting and collecting the data of those crimes being one of them. What can you recommend to ensure that CSC collects the necessary data to help better inform the issue of sexual coercion and violence within the federal prisons?
So I think we have to step back a moment from that question because I actually don't have the answer to that. But I do think that what we need is something akin to what's happening right now with the public independent inquiry into sexual misconduct in the military. I think a public independent inquiry on this issue would be well served, and then recommendations could flow from that.
Thank you for that. Are the programs and resources that are available to women offenders adequate, would you say, and what needs to change or what can be improved?
They're certainly not adequate, and the reason for that is there's always a fear of reprisal or that your personal information will be shared with others within Correctional Services Canada, or within the prisons, I should say. And so one of the recommendations that we have is to ensure that there is outside counseling and treatment available for folks who come forward or who would like to come forward, that there is some mechanism involved that is separate from the current structure. And I just wanted to say, I know this is not one of your questions, but it would be quite easy for CSC to stop strip searching in federal prisons. The current legislation is permissive. It doesn't say that it has to happen, and there is absolutely no evidence that it currently is doing what it says that it's doing. So I would make that as another recommendation.
Thank you. I was going to ask you about that, so thank you for actually
great.
So thank you for saving some time. Dr. Dube, again, thanks for all the work that you do. In one of your reports, you've raised concerns regarding the lack of clarity on meaningful human contact requirements. How do you define meaningful human contact, and are there any examples, including from other jurisdictions, internationally, maybe that can help help staff better conceptualize the term?
It's not well defined in the legislation, and that is a problem, or certainly would be a problem if CSC were even capable of providing meaningful human contact of any kind to a substantial number of prisoners. What we're finding is, however it's defined, even CSC is telling us they're not accomplishing it. So my own feeling is that meaningful human contact is something we should be concerned about defining, but at least what we have to do is to make sure that people have some form of human contact, and then we can worry about how to make it more meaningful and perhaps more human. But at the moment, we're not even getting there. So, we're not even at the first step, let alone defining how good it is.
You only have about 10 seconds, so I apologized. That's what I seems to be doing all day. I'm apologizing. With that, Madame Normandine, bienvenue au comité. 4 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
4 minutes. Thank you to the witness, and I would also like to begin by apologizing. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear the first two witnesses' testimonies, and I hope that my questions will not be redundant, given what has already been asked. I would have a question about other rights that may have been at risk because of COVID, among other things. What about the right to legal counsel? Were there several issues raised by COVID in terms of the right to counsel? Perhaps Madam Latimer, I see you shaking your head.
We have found that access to legal services has diminished during COVID, mainly because there were extremely serious lockdowns. People were confined to their cells for excessive periods of time. They weren't getting the medical treatment that they needed for other underlying conditions. They weren't getting access to counsel. There's been a recent report indicating that the internal audit of CSC indicates that when they did get access to counsel, they were often listened to, so the solicitor-client privilege elements was violated. There's a whole slew of human rights abuses well beyond the solitary confinement, but it has got to be one of the most serious, given that it is defined as a form of torture, and it's just inconsistent with the values of Canadians that it would be persisting in the way it is.
Merci beaucoup. Si jamais d'autres témoins veulent ajouter.
Thank you very much. If any other witnesses would like to add to this, please do so.
I would also like to add that, you know, one of the challenges that we've seen in the prisons during COVID-19 is a lack of access to private spaces to speak with lawyers, and also people have been asked to submit in some of the prisons reasons why they would need to speak with their lawyer, which would certainly go against you know, privilege. Confidentiality. And so I just wanted to clarify to everybody here that none of the comments that I've made earlier, I hope, would suggest that reform is going to change anything in the prisons designated for women. We cannot reform our way out of this particular issue. And I would also point to some of the recommendations made by Louise Arbour in the report on certain incidents at the prison for women to guide this committee's work as well.
Merci beaucoup. Et au niveau tant du...
Thank you very much. In terms of lockdowns, but also the spread of COVID and the breach of solicitor-client privilege, I'd like to hear how much things could have been improved had certain detention centers weren't so antiquated, having seen a few myself. They're really outdated. Could this have been avoided had there been a little bit more love in our federal prisons?
I think a lot of things could have been improved if there was goodwill and more of a creative way of approaching these things. I mean, you can see this. I talked to a lot of prisoners during this period, and they kept saying, "Why are you putting the prisoners who are ill in the hole in former segregation?" It was a very, very untherapeutic environment. He said, at this point, you don't have nobody is using the trailers, which are quite nice accommodation for personal family visits. Why not put the people who are sick in there? They're away from the rest of the, they're isolated. They can get the treatment they need without infecting others. What we found was that there is throughout a real problem with isolating those that are testing positive for COVID-19 from those that weren't. And I think that's why you see the huge spread, a quick spread of COVID in those institutions where it gets root. There were also fairly inexplicable things like 6 or 7 prisoners from the reception unit at Joyceville were transferred to other institutions in the Ontario region, and they all tested positive. Why they were transferred, I don't know.
Unfortunately,
I got a lot more, but that's
I know, I'm sure you do. We all
Sorry.
do. You're tantalizing. Merci, Madame Normandine. Mr. Harris, final 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for coming forward and for your patience and for your dedicated work over the years on these issues. It's very difficult to spend 4 minutes asking any questions that can deal with this situations which has been called a crisis, lawless, tragic, state-sponsored torture, sexual coercion and violence in the prisons that's going on recognized and on help. Is it possible to fix this? I'll ask Dr. Du, I'll ask each of the witnesses, is the only answer to, we've had Supreme Court of Canada, we've had changes in legislation, we've had your work, and still we don't see any improvement. What is the hope for this? Do we have to have a judicial inquiry? If I can have a quick yes or no on that from the witnesses, I'd like to hear that. But I'd also like to move my motion, which will take up all of my time, to continue this study next week. When we're talking about state-sponsored torture on an ongoing basis, when we're talking about the kind of treatment that we're hearing of prisoners that are suffering from mental health issues that are not being properly looked after, ongoing solitary confinement, we need to continue this study. That's extremely important. But can we have a quick answer on whether a judicial inquiry is required to do this. Dr. Duke?
I'm not sure what the best way of dealing with this problem is. It would seem to me that one of our first problems is that CSC is not addressing any of these issues.
Yeah,
one
that's
of
the
the
problem.
things that our report shows over and over again is a huge variability across the country. So some places are much worse than others. Why can't we learn from those experiences?
Who can fix it? They're not learning from what you say. They're not even relating properly to you. So I guess they have to find out how do we fix it.
My own feeling is that part of what is necessary but not sufficient is a decent form of independent overview of what's going on. We don't have that. That would be a starting point.
Thank you. And I guess if the time will run out, Chair, if we asked all the other witnesses to respond to that, I would like to have a vote on my motion, if that's possible.
Okay. I'm happy to facilitate that in the last 2 minutes that we have. But before I do, I just want to thank the witnesses again for their patience, and certainly what you've had said to the committee is extremely disturbing and worthy of further inquiry on the part of this committee. So let's again, we'll release you again, apologizing for just the way things are.
Thank
Democracy
you. Thank
grand.
you very much.
Thank you for the time.
So with that, Mr. Harris has moved his motion. Essentially, we've agreed that next week will be dedicated to the motion to invite what we just debated for the last hour. And so the second time together, you basically have a choice between a Levesque study, the continuing with CSC study, or a border study. And that's what it boils down to. So I'm open to, well, I'm not that open because I'm at 7:10 and the whip's office is going to get excited. So I see Mr. Lightbound and Mr. Fisher.
Je vais être bref, Monsieur le Président, puis...
I'll be brief, Chair. I am also disappointed that we've had so little time with the witnesses who were so extraordinary and who had such relevant things to say. I do want to raise the fact that in our agreement regarding the number of meetings and the topics of the meetings, Christian Michaud, who is now caught in his other block committee, absolutely wanted a border meeting, and that meeting was supposed to be for next week normally. And so I cannot easily support what Mr. Harris is proposing, given our commitment with respect to Christian Michaud of the bloc.
Mr. Fisher, last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I was going to say what Joel said. Like, I thought we had sort of agreed on behalf of the Bloc Québécois that we would do the borders. But I'm also, Mr. Chair, not really. Mr. Harris moved his motion really, really quickly. I'm looking for an email to see if it came by email, and I don't know whether he has to submit it in the English and French when he's doing it from the floor. Perhaps he doesn't have to, but I know that Madame Normandin would probably appreciate seeing it in French, especially if it's going to replace something that this committee agreed to as a request by the bloc. So I'm not certain that I have a lot of interest in supporting this, unless we had time to actually discuss it.
Okay, I'm going to have to adjourn at this point without resolution of this motion. What I know at this point, the clerk has instructions to invite 2 witnesses to study to continue the IMVE study for 90 minutes plus 30 minutes to decide what it is we want to do. So that will occupy either the Monday or the Wednesday. If there's no other resolution, if it's on the Monday, that would bump the border study, and if it's on the Wednesday, it'd be bump the Levesque study. And that's kind of where we're at, unless you can collectively tell me something differently. So with that, I regrettably have to call the meeting, adjourn the meeting. So.